Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Nicte Fuller Medina, and Christopher the Shield and I are going to be talking about how we view newspaper poems from our respective disciplinary lenses. In earlier presentations, we talked about the projects that we lead, and right now I'd like to highlight where we overlap, or in other words, the motivation for our collaboration. The overlaps in our projects include archival sources as being central to our work, framing these sources as patrimony, our deep commitment and interest in broad public access, which includes concerns around repatriation and which centers source communities. And of course, the transdisciplinarity which runs through our research areas. Our projects individually and through this collaboration bring together literature and linguistics, but also cultural studies, critical archival studies, history, and cultural heritage, among other areas. And I'll get us started by looking at linguistic approaches, showing you why a linguist might be interested in 19th century and early 20th century Creole poems, and show you one aspect of linguistic analysis, which is a focus on linguistic features rather than the content of the poems, and a snapshot into data preparation. My research focuses on language in Belize, and this includes multilingualism, Belize Kriol, and broadly speaking, language change and variation over time. To investigate the latter, it's essential to have samples of language use from multiple points in time, at least 2 points in time. And since we can't go back in time, archival data is invaluable. Audio recordings, sound recordings are particularly valuable as they capture naturalistic speech. But recordings earlier than the 1970s, let's say, are particularly rare. And so sometimes we have to rely on incomplete or potentially non representative data as historical benchmarks. And this is where Creole newspaper poems come in. Now, diachronic analysis of Creole through these poems, or the study of Creole over time through these poems, can help to counter some myths about Creole. Or what's termed Creole exceptionalism. Such myths include the idea that Creoles are young languages, and as young languages, they haven't had enough time to develop the structural complexity that we might observe in other languages. Now, I don't agree with this, but these historical linguistic benchmarks through the newspaper poems and other such data can offer an evidence base from which to counter some of these myths. At the same time, these poems can give us insight into the legitimacy or the status of Creole at the time that the poems were written. In order for the poems to be useful as data for addressing these questions, we must first determine what counts as Creole in these poems, given that Creole and English share a lot of the same vocabulary. The sound system, lexicon or vocabulary, and the grammar of Creole becomes crucial. Starting with the sound system, Creole does not have these TH sounds that English has. As a result, words like think and them are typically represented in the written form with T and D at the beginning of the words, producing forms like think and them. And we see this usage in the poems, which I'll show you on the next slide. At the level of the lexicon or vocabulary, Creole specific words such as picnic, which is still used today, helps us to identify Creoles, and we see this in the poem Granny's Stories, Old Hag. At the level of the grammar, we can look at how words and sentences are put together, as well as the ways in which the past, present, and future tense is expressed in Creole. So, in example one here, a sick indicates that I am currently sick, whereas number two, I'm sick, the me in that sentence indicates the past tense. So, I was sick at some point in the past. And we see that this same past tense marker appears in Granny's Stories in the example there, when I'm Lil. And so, what you see here is an early stage of data preparation, where student research assistants Jamie Lee Garcia and Elizabeth Bailey reproduce poems from scans from the newspapers into a token file or an Excel sheet, which is what you see here. And this makes it easier to identify each instance in each line of the poem that could be Creole and what feature of Creole is being used. So, is it from the sound system, the lexicon, or a deeper level of grammar? So on the far right, you see those instances there, which I've highlighted in red, blue, and green as potential instances of Creole. The ones in red, they, them, and they, are all written the way we might use those words in Creole, which arguably could be a feature of Belizean English and not just Creole, but there's some grammatical features there as well. Looking a bit more closely now, in example three, we see the word day, which is reflecting the sound system of Creole. But the phrase not no monster in that same example is double negation. Now, this structure is not restricted to Creole languages, but it is well documented in Creoles and it's not associated with standardized English, so I would count that as Creole usage. I'd like to contrast 4 and 5 now, which both have the word them. And in 4, this is simply reflecting the Creole sound system because that word is the third person plural pronoun, which in English we would produce as them. But the them in 5 is not a pronoun, but rather a prenominal plural marker. Note that it appears before the noun big airship, and airship does not have an S on the N. And this is prototypically how we would mark the plural in Belize Kriol. Now, this usage of plural marking and negation are grammatical features, and they're not as easy to pick out like vocabulary items such as the word picnic, for example. This means that they're not as easy to imitate, which suggests to me that this is authentic Creole usage because this usage requires a deeper level of knowledge about the language itself. Now, it may seem straightforward to identify and confirm Creole usage in these poems, and certainly these poems as data are invaluable historical benchmarks. Another benefit, of course, are that these poems are written by Belizeans in contrast to many earlier Creole texts which are written by non Creolophones and which call into question the authenticity of the language use in those earlier texts. As poems written by Belizeans, they can potentially elucidate the status of Creole and the legitimacy of Creole at the time that the poems were written. On the other hand, it's necessary to balance all of these benefits with some cautions. Linguists such as myself prefer to analyze language as it's naturally used in the everyday lives of the language users, rather than in this genre specific way and by a small group of people who are very likely a literate elite. We don't know, for example, how authentic the Creole usage is. Does it align with language as it was used at that time? Or is it aligning with symbolic usage to mark identity, for example? Or perhaps aligning with the trend of dialect poetry of the time? Finally, quantitative analysis, which would yield the richest results, is limited by the small number of poems written in Creole and by the potential stylistic restrictions of the genre, which may have led poets to make decisions based on poetic structure rather than reflecting their natural language use. And now we're going to move on to hear about literary approaches.
I open with this audio clip. It presents logwood and mahogany cutters shanties circa 1920, unearthed months ago by the Belize Music Project, which is an initiative aiming to rediscover Belizean musical history and traditions for a contemporary Belize, to educate, disseminate, and ultimately inspire new generations of Belizean artists and citizens. And this facilitates a literary approach that I'd like to share with you all, which I feel is consonant with the linguistic approaches, which attempt to substantiate the autonomy and identity of the language in play. Literary and cultural analyses can trace influences, both local and foreign, attending these published poems.
To that song, the woodcutters set off to work in the early hours of the
A
morning,
recording
50
company
or more
captured
years
these
ago,
songs
in
sung
the
at the
days
logging
before the
camp some
mechanization.
100 years ago near Burl Boom. For those who don't know, a village around Mahogany Works in the Belize district, upriver from the Belize City estuary, where logs would be floated for collection at the harbor. From the narrator in the clip, we understand the music features songs that would have been sung 50 years prior to even this clip, or in the 19th century, as the men set off to work logging in the forest for their 7 or 4. The rations that constituted their pay of 4 pounds of salt pork and 7 pounds of flour, plus the monthly wage of $10, a blue shirt, tam o'shanter, and a cacho that the clip describes as a cow horn for holding a glass worth of rum. And this was promised to them when they set off at about 4 a.m. in the morning.
Poetic ethnography is but one way to approach the archive of newspaper poetry. My own research interests prompt me to think about how the poetry in the newspapers is connected to other Belizean political and historical factors. How the poetry reflects the evolution of the Belizean national subject, for instance, or how social and political history is engaged. In this way, the poet's linguistic and artistic choices run consonant with political signification. If poetic ethnography gives insight into actually existing social relations, rhetorical analysis could reveal how poetic personas are articulated using cultural and political facts. We might evaluate the success of certain genre conventions to see how poets adopt, either wholesale or in part, or localize, or indigenize, or subvert source material. Thick description and deep contextualization can contribute to a fuller literary historical portrait of our nation. Combining literary questions with the linguistic, one might ask what sorts of choices are reflections of authentic languages and which are mere poetic insertions for semantic reasons. With methods in the digital humanities, we can analyze word variety, lexical frequency, metric constraints, syllabic consistency, and so on.
Perhaps the major conceit of my approach to this archive is to consider the archive a national utterance. That is, the sum total of the pieces collected in the archive and selected for publication in the various early papers of Belize represents a sort of mediated, complex, collective national utterance. While membership of contributors to the archive has undoubtedly been mediated, ignoring potential contributions of so many on the margins of privilege, the evolution extent of those that did manage admission is interesting, both for what it contains and does not contain. The assumption I make here is that meaning might be made of the collective utterance of these poetic voices in our early newspapers. While it may seem that songs connect listeners to the Creole speaking laborer class in a direct and immediate way, the mediation, the staging, and the presentation of the recording are also significant. There is an interpretive insider role that the narrator adopts with his announcer's timbre. The poems in the archive, especially those marked by Creole, capture some of the song and dialect that might have been spoken at the time and published for an audience both domestic and foreign. Check out J.S. Martinez's poem Hard Times, for example, which was published in a newspaper in 1930. Logwood cutting is completely stopped. Chicle and mahogany getting scarce. Planters say that flood destroyed them crop. Hardship everywhere you turn your face. Everywhere you go, you hear them say, time is getting harder every day. The staging of voice on radio and in print both reveal a kind of performance, including a performance of subjectivity. This experiment with emergent indigenous linguistic and literary style parallels the search for political and economic autonomy. As dialect becomes a shibboleth for belonging, a new subjectivity is found in the pages of the newspapers. Contemporary performances that are celebrated today and are being enshrined by such forces as the Belize Music Project are connected through time to the ones treated by patronizing observers, like that of the 1920 Belize Independent here, who positions himself as a disinterested scientific observer, commenting on the quote, grotesque nature of local artistic creation, with its unique instrumentation, dancing figures, the jawbones, the turtle shells, the grater, the drums, the language. Thus, an oral tradition which predates it also parallels the written poetry in the newspaper archive. And this is all bound up with the legacy of performance poets today. In this way, the complex negotiation that goes into creating a poem that draws on diverse imported and indigenous styles might be seen as an allegory of the complex negotiation which goes into narrating Belizean Creole and national identities.